They rode off into the sunset, a rich man and a woman from the streets, holding hands as the city sparkled below them. It felt perfect, too perfect. But what if I told you that their happily ever after didn't last forever? What if, behind that limo ride and that romantic kiss, there was a truth nobody wanted to see? This is the story of what really happened after the credits rolled in Pretty Woman. It was the movie that made millions believe in love again. Pretty Woman wasn't just another romantic comedy. It was a modern fairy tale for a world that had stopped believing in happy endings. Vivian Ward wasn't a princess locked in a tower. She was a woman trapped in a life she didn't choose. The streets of Hollywood Boulevard were her castle. Her crown was a red dress and a fearless smile. Then came Edward Lewis. The man who had everything except a heart that could feel. A cold businessman living in glass towers, making deals worth millions, but never learning how to love. When their worlds collided, it wasn't supposed to be love. It was just business, a deal for 1 week. But somehow, that week changed everything. As the story unfolded, audiences saw something rare. Two broken people helping each other heal. Vivian reminded Edward that there's more to life than money, and Edward showed Vivian that she was worthy of more than what the world told her she deserved. When the movie ended, Edward climbing the fire escape, holding flowers, promising forever, the world sighed with joy. It was a perfect ending, one that made us believe that love can conquer class, money, and pain. But life doesn't follow the same script as Hollywood. In real life, fairy tales fade. Love, no matter how magical, has to face the weight of reality. And if you look closer, even in that final scene, there's a question hiding behind Vivian's smile. What happens next? The limo drives away, the camera fades, and the music plays. But what if their story didn't end there? What if it was only the beginning of something much more complicated, a love that had to fight to survive outside the fantasy? What if I told you Pretty Woman was never meant to be a love story? Before the roses, before the red dress, before the charming smile of Edward Lewis, there was another version. A darker, colder version. One that didn't end with a kiss, but with heartbreak. The original script was called 3000, named after the price Edward paid Vivian for 1 week of her time. In this version, there was no limo, no fairy tale rescue, and no gentle transformation. Vivian wasn't a hopeful dreamer waiting for love. She was a woman lost in addiction, fighting to survive another night on the streets. Edward wasn't a romantic savior. He was a man who bought people like he bought companies, and then discarded them when he was done. The ending: Edward throws Vivian out of the car, leaving her alone with the money. No music, no happy ever after. Just silence and heartbreak. That was the story Disney bought and then completely rewrote. What started as a dark tale of power and desperation turned into one of the most beloved love stories in cinema history. But think about it. If Pretty Woman was born from such pain, could its happy ending ever truly last? Maybe the real sequel was never filmed because it would have broken the illusion. Because if we followed Vivian and Edward past that balcony, we might have seen the cracks in their paradise. A man used to control, a woman trying to rebuild her self-worth. Two people from different worlds, struggling to make love fit into a life built on lies, money, and fantasy. That's the version we never saw, the one that hides behind the bright lights of Hollywood. And maybe that's why there's no Pretty Woman too, because deep down, even the filmmakers knew, the magic only works as long as the curtain stays closed. Once the credits faded and the music stopped, Vivian and Edward had to live what every fairy tale avoids: real life. The dream was over. No more glass slippers, no white limos under pink sunsets. Just two people trying to make love work in a world that didn't believe they belonged together. Imagine it. Vivian, the girl who once walked Hollywood Boulevard, now walking into board meetings and charity galas, rooms full of people who smiled politely but whispered behind her back. Her past wasn't a secret. It was a headline waiting to happen. Every glance reminded her she wasn't one of them. And Edward. They tried to protect her, but old habits die hard. His world ran on control, contracts, and power. He was used to fixing problems with money, but But Vivian wasn't a problem. She was a storm he couldn't predict. The tension built quietly. At first it was small things, the way she dressed, the friends she missed, the nights he stayed late at work. But love, when tested by the real world, begins to show its cracks. Vivian wanted freedom, Edward wanted order. She wanted laughter, he wanted silence. They were in love, yes, but love alone wasn't enough to bridge two completely different worlds. One day, maybe after another argument about the same things, Vivian looked in the mirror and realized something painful. She had changed too much, trying to fit into his world. The girl who once danced barefoot in cheap shoes was now hidden behind designer heels and forced smiles. Edward saw it too, but didn't know how to reach her anymore. Their love story, once built on passion and fantasy, was slowly turning into sif. A performance, one for the cameras, one for society, and one they both pretended to believe in. And maybe that's the tragedy of their happily ever after. Not that it ended, but that it became something neither of them recognized. Vivian didn't need saving anymore. She needed to remember who she was. And Edward, the man who climbed the fire escape to rescue her, now found himself watching her climb away, this time to save herself. They never made Pretty Woman 2, and maybe that silence says more than any sequel ever could. Because behind every red carpet smile, behind every interview laugh, Julia Roberts and Richard Gere both knew some stories are meant to end before they fall apart. When Julia Roberts was asked if she'd ever return as Vivian, she smiled, paused, and said softly, "People don't want to see Vivian and Edward fighting about taxes." It was a joke, but one that carried a truth only grown-up hearts could understand. The fantasy of Pretty Woman wasn't about what happens after love begins. It was about the magic of believing that it could. Richard Gere once admitted that he loved the ending because it felt right, said it ended on the note of hope. And hope, not reality, is what the movie gave the world. It gave lonely hearts something to believe in, even if only for 2 hours. But in the real world, love isn't written in neat, happy endings. It's messy, hard, and sometimes it doesn't last. Maybe that's why no sequel ever came, because real life would have ruined the dream. Still, both actors carried those characters with them. Julia, now one of the most iconic actresses in Hollywood, often said Vivian changed her life. And in a way, she changed ours too. She showed us that even someone from the roughest corners of the world can find love, dignity, and a sense of worth. Edward, the man who learned to open his heart, became the symbol of what people want love to look like, not what it usually is. So maybe the real Pretty Woman 2 doesn't exist on film. Maybe it exists in all the women who found strength in Vivian's story, in all the people who saw themselves in her, wanting more than the hand they were dealt, because sometimes the best sequels aren't written in scripts. They're written in the hearts of the people who believed in them. And that's the quiet beauty of it all. Pretty Woman didn't need a second chapter to stay alive. The fairy tale ended exactly where it should before real life could take it apart. If Pretty Woman were made now, it wouldn't start with a limo or a business deal. It would start with a woman who doesn't need saving. Vivian wouldn't be waiting for Edward to show her worth. She'd already know it. The streets of Hollywood would be replaced by the digital world. Neon lights traded for phone screens and dating apps, where love stories begin with swipes instead of chance encounters. In this version, Vivian would be running her own boutique, helping other women rebuild their lives, women who've been overlooked, underestimated, or judged. Her charm would still shine, but her power would come from choice, not circumstance. And Edward, he'd still be successful, but not the man who measures life in profit margins. He'd be the one learning to unlearn, the man trying to balance wealth with warmth, logic with emotion. Their love story would be different. No one would save anyone. They'd build something together, to people who have lived, failed, and decided to grow side by side. Their challenges wouldn't be about class or money, but about time, trust, and vulnerability in a world that moves too fast for real connection. Imagine them sitting in a cafe, not a penthouse, talking about dreams instead of deals. That's what Pretty Woman would look like now. Less fairy tale, more truth. In the age of independence, Vivian's story wouldn't end with a man climbing a fire escape. It would end with both of them meeting halfway. Not above her, not below him, just equal. Because the modern fairy tale isn't about being rescued anymore. It's about being seen. And maybe that's why Pretty Woman still matters today. It reminds us how far we've come from a story about finding love through rescue to a story about finding love through respect. The pretty woman of this generation doesn't wait for her prince. She builds her own castle, opens the door herself, and invites love in when she's ready. If Pretty Woman were made now, it wouldn't start with a limo or a business deal. It wouldn't start with a limo or a business deal. It would start with a woman who doesn't need saving. Vivian wouldn't be waiting for Edward to show her worth. She'd already know it. The streets of Hollywood would be replaced by the digital world neon lights, traded for phone screens and dating apps where love stories begin with swipes instead of chance encounters. In this version, Vivian would be running her own boutique, helping other women rebuild their lives, women who've been overlooked, underestimated, or judged. Her charm would still shine, but her power would come from choice, not circumstance. And Edward. He'd still be successful, but not the man who measures life in profit margins. He'd be the one learning to unlearn, the man trying to balance wealth with warmth, logic with emotion. Their love story would be different. No one would save anyone. They'd build something together to people who have lived, failed, and decided to grow side by side. Their challenges wouldn't be about class or money, but about time, trust, and vulnerability in a world that moves too fast for real connection. Imagine them sitting in a cafe, not a penthouse, talking about dreams instead of deals. That's what Pretty Woman would look like now. Less fairy tale or truth. In the age of independence, Vivian's story wouldn't end with a man climbing a fire escape. It would end with both of them meeting halfway, not above her, not below him. Just equal? Because the modern fairy tale isn't about being rescued anymore. It's about being seen. And maybe that's why Pretty Woman still matters today. It reminds us how far we've come from a story about finding love through rescue to a story about finding love through respect. The pretty woman of this generation doesn't wait for her prince. She builds her own castle, opens the door herself, and invites love in when she's ready. Every fairy tale ends with a kiss, but real life begins the moment after it fades. The truth is, Pretty Woman gave us what we all wanted, a perfect ending. But perfection is fragile. It doesn't live in limos or penthouses. It lives in the quiet moments, in the arguments, the apologies, and the decisions that come after the magic wears off. Maybe years later, Vivian and Edward weren't the couple we imagined. Maybe their story wasn't filled with diamonds and laughter, but with lessons. Vivian, once the woman rescued, became the rescuer for herself. She learned that love isn't meant to complete you. It's meant to meet you where you already stand. And Edward. He discovered that the real cost of love isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in vulnerability. In letting go of the control he once believed kept him safe. Reality doesn't care about cinematic, music, or sweeping camera angles. It asks the harder questions. Can you stay when things stop being perfect? Can love survive once it's stripped of fantasy? The fairy tale promised them forever. But reality demanded work, the kind of work that doesn't fit neatly into a 2-hour film. Maybe that's why Pretty Woman 2 never existed. Because reality doesn't sell tickets the way dreams do. But maybe that's also why the story still lives in our minds. Because we know, deep down, that happily ever after isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the real one. So when you think about Vivian and Edward, don't picture them frozen in that final kiss. Picture them years later, still trying, still growing, still learning what love truly means. Because real love isn't about being rescued. It's about choosing each other again and again, even when the fairy tale ends. And maybe that's the most beautiful ending of all. Not a perfect one, but a real one.